I do not know what made my hands colder when the plane touched down in Keflavík. The Icelandic wind, or my screen lighting up with 43 missed calls. My mother's first text read, "You need to call back immediately. This has gone too far." The second, from my father, read, "If you do not fix this, the family will lose everything." The problem is, I had done nothing. I simply said no. For the first time in my life, my name is Riley Roberts. I am 37 years old. I do not know what made my hands colder when the plane finally touched down at Keflavík International Airport. The biting Icelandic wind seeping through the cabin walls, or the harsh blue light of my phone screen as it reconnected to the world. We had just survived a grueling red-eye flight, a 6-hour journey across the Atlantic to celebrate our wedding anniversary. I expected the usual travel fatigue, the stiff neck, the dry eyes. I did not expect an avalanche. The moment the cell tower caught my signal, the device in my palm practically convulsed. It vibrated with a violent, uninterrupted rhythm. The notifications did not trickle in. They flooded the screen in a desperate, suffocating wave. I stared at the bright rectangle, my brain struggling to process the sheer volume of panic encapsulated in red notification badges. 43 missed calls, not 3, not 14, 43. Accompanying them were dozens of text messages and a rapidly overflowing voicemail inbox. I stood in the narrow aisle of the Boeing, passengers shuffling and dragging carry-on bags around me, but the ambient noise of the cabin faded into a dull roar. I swiped down, reading the names stacked in a terrifying, repetitive column: Mom, Dad, Mason, Tessa, unknown number, Mom again, Mason again, Dad, Mom, Mason. The timestamps were relentless, spanning the entire duration of my flight. They had called at 1 in the morning, 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, back in our home time zone. Usually, a missed call from my mother meant she wanted to complain about the neighbors. A text from my brother, Mason, usually meant he needed a quick loan for some vague business venture. But this frequency was entirely different. This was not the standard family guilt trip. This was not a passive-aggressive pout because I had dared to take a vacation. The pattern of these calls, the chaotic rotation between my parents and my brother, and the deafening silence from my sister-in-law Tessa until the very end, painted a picture of absolute unmitigated disaster. My thumb hovered over the screen. My heart hammered against my ribs. A stark contrast to the exhausting stillness of the overnight flight. I felt the familiar, toxic cocktail of dread and obligation rising in my throat. For my entire adult life, I had been the designated crisis manager. I was the reliable one, the one who answered the phone at 4 in the morning to fix whatever mess Mason had created and my parents had enabled. I pressed the phone to my ear, the cold glass shocking my skin, and tapped the first voicemail from my mother, Elaine. I braced myself for the tears, or perhaps the frantic pleading. Instead, her voice cut through the earpiece like a serrated knife. It was entirely devoid of warmth, entirely devoid of the basic maternal instinct to check if her daughter's metal tube had safely crossed an ocean. "Riley, you need to call back immediately." The recording began, her tone sharp, breathless, and laced with absolute fury. "This has gone too far. You have completely ruined everything this time. You are destroying your brother's life. Call your father the second you get this. Do not ignore us." She hung up. The automated voice prompted me to save or delete. I just stood there, letting the words echo in my tired mind. "You have completely ruined everything this time." The sheer audacity of the accusation left me momentarily breathless. I had been sitting in my seat, drinking lukewarm ginger ale and trying to sleep. I had done absolutely nothing. And yet, somehow, I was the villain in a catastrophe I knew nothing about. Her message emphasized a harsh, undeniable truth about my role in the Roberts family dynamic. They did not care where I was. They did not care about my safety, and they certainly did not care about my anniversary. They only cared that I was not there, readily available to be deployed as their personal shield. I skipped my father's voicemails. I knew exactly what they would sound like: heavy sighs, veiled threats about family loyalty, the usual patriarchal disappointment. Instead, my finger drifted to the unknown number. It had an area code from a state I did not live in. I tapped play. The voice was professional, clipped, and entirely detached from the emotional, hysterical breakdown of my relatives. "This is an urgent message for Riley Roberts," the male voice stated smoothly. "This is David calling from Meridian Crest Capital. We require immediate contact regarding the active file. We need to verify your guarantor status to proceed with the release of the funds. The deadline is approaching, and failure to confirm will result in the immediate cancellation of the bridge financing. Please return this call at your earliest convenience. Guarantor." The word dropped into my stomach like a lead weight. I played the message again. Meridian Crest Capital. Guarantor status. Bridge financing. The financial terminology swirled in my head, completely detached from reality. I am a project operations director. I deal with civic systems, logistics, and supply chains. I understand contracts. I understand financial obligations, which is exactly why I knew, with absolute, terrifying certainty, that I had not signed a single document acting as a guarantor for anyone. I had not co-signed a car loan, a mortgage, or a business line of credit. I had not put my name, my credit score, or my financial stability on the line for anything in the past 5 years, especially not for Mason. Yet, here was a corporate entity, leaving a legally phrased voicemail, demanding my verification. The panic that had been bubbling in my chest suddenly turned freezing cold. The 43 missed calls were no longer just a family throwing a tantrum because I had set a boundary. They were the desperate, frantic actions of people who had been caught. My parents and my brother were not trying to guilt me into helping them. They were trying to get to me before Meridian Crest Capital did. "Riley." The voice was soft, grounding, and completely sane. I looked up. My husband, Miles Brennan, was standing in the aisle, his duffel bag slung over one broad shoulder. His calm gray eyes scanned my face, instantly registering the blood that had drained from my cheeks. Miles is a man of remarkable perception. He does not need to read my text messages to know when my family is poisoning my airspace. He has watched them do it for 7 years. He stepped closer, creating a small, protective barrier between me and the impatient passengers trying to exit the aircraft. He did not snatch the phone from my hand. He did not demand to know what was wrong. He simply looked at me, assessing the damage. "How bad is it?" he asked quietly. I opened my mouth to explain, to pour out the nonsense about Meridian Crest Capital and guarantors and Mason's ruined life, but the words caught in my throat. I just turned the screen toward him, letting him see the sea of red notifications, the 43 missed calls, the frantic text messages. Miles looked at the screen, then back up at me. His jaw tightened just a fraction, the only outward sign of his anger on my behalf. "Okay," he said, his voice steady. "Here is the question. Do you want to know everything right now, or do you want to keep this trip from being stolen by them?" It was a profound question, simple, yet impossibly heavy. We had saved for 2 entire years for this trip. We had sacrificed weekends, skipped expensive dinners, and meticulously planned every single detail to celebrate our anniversary in the shadow of glaciers and volcanoes. We were standing in Iceland, a place of stunning, raw beauty, and my family was reaching across the ocean, dragging their chaos right into the center of my marriage. If I called my mother back, the vacation was over. If I called Meridian Crest Capital, the vacation was over. I would spend the next 7 days on international roaming, fighting, crying, and fixing. I looked at Miles. I looked at the dark, rugged landscape visible through the tiny airplane window. Then, I looked back at the glowing screen in my hand. For 37 years, my default setting had been compliance. When they called, I answered. When they broke things, I glued them back together. But the word guarantor echoed in my ears, bringing with it a profound sense of violation that superseded my lifelong conditioning. I did not owe them this trip. I took a deep breath. Slowly, methodically, I opened my recent calls list. I pressed the buttons on the side of my phone, taking a screenshot. Snap. I opened my text messages. Snap. I opened the voicemail log. Snap. I documented the exact timeline of their hysteria. Once the digital evidence was secured in my photo gallery, I swiped down to the control center. With a deliberate, almost agonizingly slow motion, I tapped the cellular data icon. It faded from green to gray. I tapped the Wi-Fi icon. Gray. I tapped the airplane mode icon, turning it back on. The phone went dead, severing the invisible tethers that bound me to the Roberts family drama. I slid the useless piece of metal and glass into my coat pocket. "I want to keep the trip," I told Miles, my voice trembling slightly but ringing with a strange, new conviction. A slow, proud smile spread across his face. He reached out, lacing his fingers through mine, his grip warm and solid against the chill of the cabin. "Good," he said. "Then let us go see some glaciers. The baggage claim is this way." We moved down the aisle, stepping out of the metal tube and into the crisp, biting air of the Icelandic morning. I walked beside my husband, my hand in his, trying to focus on the adventure ahead. But deep down, the icy knot in my stomach refused to melt. I had silenced the noise, but I could not silence the knowledge that a storm of unimaginable proportions was waiting for me back on American soil. To understand why a single, simple word like no could detonate a bomb large enough to generate 43 frantic phone calls, dozens of hateful messages, and the involvement of a mysterious financial firm, we have to rewind. We have to go back many years, back to the very foundation of my family. We have to go back to the days when I first learned that my sole purpose in the Roberts household was not to be a daughter, but to be the designated survivor, the silent architect of their rescues, and the permanent fixer of all their catastrophic mistakes. I am the project operations director at Alderaan Civic Systems. To the outside world, it sounds like a sterile corporate title, the kind of job description you skim over on a networking profile. But in the trenches, it means I am a professional crisis manager. I oversee the digital infrastructure for municipal governments. If a city's public transit tracking system crashes during a blizzard, or a zoning portal goes offline 3 days before a major filing deadline affecting hundreds of thousands of residents, my phone is the one that rings. I spend my days in glass-walled conference rooms, dissecting catastrophic failures, realigning blown budgets, and forcing chaotic situations back into rigid functional timelines. I do not panic. I build contingency plans for my contingency plans. I am the designated adult in rooms full of panicked executives. It is no accident that I ended up in a career predicated on disaster recovery. I was unknowingly training for it my entire life, long before I had a corner office, a salary, or a team of engineers relying on my judgment. I was the permanent, unpaid operations director for the Roberts family. My husband, Miles, saw the architecture of this dysfunction long before I was ready to admit it existed. Miles is a structural engineer by trade, a man who spends his life calculating load-bearing capacities and stress points. He looks at bridges and skyscrapers and knows exactly which beam is carrying more weight than it was designed to hold. About 2 years into our relationship, he started looking at me with that exact same analytical, sympathetic gaze. He is a deeply calm, pragmatic man. He has never once tried to control me, nor has he ever demanded I cut ties with my parents or my brother. He simply observes. He would sit at our kitchen island on a Sunday morning, nursing a mug of black coffee, watching my shoulders hike up to my ears as I drafted a meticulously worded email to get my family out of yet another jam. He would wait until I hit send, slide a fresh cup of coffee across the granite counter to me, and ask quietly if I realized I was holding up a ceiling that was actively trying to crush me. The ceiling, in almost every scenario, was my older brother. Mason. If you grew up in America, you likely know a Mason. He is the textbook definition of the golden child, armed with unearned confidence, a charismatic smile, and a vocabulary entirely composed of startup buzzwords he heard on a podcast. Mason is the ideas guy. He is the visionary. He is the man standing in front of a whiteboard, holding a dry erase marker, sketching out paradigms and synergies while completely ignoring the fact that he has not paid his electric bill in 3 months. Let us take a brief, painful tour of the Mason Roberts empire of failed ventures. First, there was the rugged outdoor apparel company. It folded after a mere 8 months because Mason spent 70% of the initial seed money on aggressive branding, a sleek logo design, and high-production promotional videos shot in the Pacific Northwest, completely forgetting to secure a reliable manufacturer for the actual waterproof jackets he was supposed to be selling. Then came the e-commerce dropshipping phase. That resulted in his rented garage being filled to the brim with cheap, defective electronics from overseas and a barrage of furious customer emails that I had to spend 48 hours helping him categorize and refund. Following that was the artisanal, ethically sourced coffee brand. He took out a massive personal loan to buy a $12,000 commercial roaster that he did not even know how to calibrate. That venture lasted exactly 1 year. Most recently, there was the exclusive tier-based subscription platform for aspiring entrepreneurs, which mercifully died in the beta testing phase before he could lose anyone else's money. Every single failure came pre-packaged with a brilliant, temporary excuse. The market experienced an unprecedented shift. The global supply chain collapsed. The social media algorithm changed without warning. The investors lacked vision. It was never a flaw in Mason's work ethic, and it was certainly never his utter lack of basic business acumen. He was simply a misunderstood genius, a tragic victim of bad timing, waiting for the universe to finally recognize his brilliance. And while he waited, standing comfortably in the wreckage of his own making, I was the one quietly sweeping up the shattered glass so he would not cut his feet. My parents, Elaine and Warren, were the grand architects of this delusion. To them, my competence was not a trait to be celebrated or nurtured. It was a free utility to be ruthlessly exploited. They rarely called me just to ask how my day was, or what Miles and I were doing for the weekend. A phone call from my parents almost always began with an imperative verb, a command disguised as a casual request. "Riley, look at this commercial lease agreement for your brother. The language seems tricky. Riley, get on the phone with the branch manager at the bank and figure out why your father's overdraft fee was not waived like they promised. Riley, read through these vendor terms and conditions tonight. Mason does not have the bandwidth to deal with the fine print right now. I was not a daughter in their eyes. I was a retainer-free legal consultant, an administrative assistant, and a bottomless emergency fund all rolled into one convenient, compliant package. I cannot begin to calculate the sheer volume of time and money I bled into my brother's delusions. I remember wiring him $3,000 on a Tuesday afternoon to cover a critical shortfall in his payroll, promising myself it was the absolute last time I would act as his personal ATM. I spent countless Saturday nights sitting cross-legged on the floor of his various apartments, sorting through shoeboxes full of crumpled, coffee-stained receipts, building complex spreadsheets so the Internal Revenue Service would not audit him into federal prison. I stood in my own hallway, still wearing my winter coat, aggressively negotiating with angry wholesale suppliers on speakerphone while Mason sat on my couch, chewing his thumbnails and looking like a scolded child. I gave up my weekends, my paid time off, and my mental peace to construct elaborate safety nets for a 39-year-old man who made a sport out of jumping off financial cliffs. And the most insidious part of it all, none of it was viewed as a favor. It was never treated as an extraordinary act of sibling devotion. It was simply the natural order of our family ecosystem. It was an expectation. The vast, echoing disparity in how Mason and I were treated became violently obvious whenever I actually had something of my own to celebrate. I will never forget the evening I took my parents and Mason out to a high-end steakhouse downtown to announce my promotion to director at Alderaan. It was a massive milestone. I had worked grueling, 80-hour weeks for a solid year to prove I could handle the role. I was going to be managing a departmental budget of $15 million. I bought an incredibly expensive bottle of red wine for the table. I smiled. my heart swelling with a rare moment of pride, and told them the news. I told them about the title, the responsibilities, and the 20% raise. My mother politely dabbed the corner of her mouth with a linen napkin. "Oh, that is nice, honey," she said, before taking a slow sip of her wine. My father gave a brief, tight nod of acknowledgement. Total elapsed time spent celebrating my career-defining achievement approximately 14 seconds. Before the waiter even arrived with our appetizers, the conversation seamlessly, effortlessly pivoted right back to Mason. Mason, who was currently unemployed, drowning in credit card debt, and living in a duplex that my parents were secretly helping subsidize. "So, Mason," my father said, leaning forward across the white tablecloth, his eyes lighting up with a genuine, profound enthusiasm that I had never, ever seen directed at me. "Tell us more about that new logistics application you were thinking about pitching. It sounds like an absolute game changer for the industry." I sat there in the dim light of the restaurant, methodically cutting my steak into tiny, perfect squares. I listened to them discuss imaginary venture capital for an imaginary application built by a man who could not balance a standard checking account. The expensive wine tasted like ash in my mouth. It was in that exact moment, surrounded by the clinking of fine silver and the murmur of other families, that the reality of my existence crystallized. My tangible, hard-fought, undeniable reality would always be completely invisible when placed next to the blinding, holy light of my brother's hypothetical potential. That is the bitter, unspoken constitution of the Roberts family. Mason is allowed to be wrong. He is allowed to fail, to flounder, to drag other people down with him, over and over again. He is granted infinite grace because he is a dreamer chasing greatness. He has potential. But me, I am not afforded the luxury of a single mistake. I am not allowed to drop a ball, miss a detail, or experience a moment of weakness. I must always be right. I must always be stable, predictable, and immediately available to fix the collateral damage. If you ask my parents why, they will not say it is because they love me less. They will simply wave a dismissive hand, smile a hollow smile, and say the 4 words that have served as the bars of my invisible cage for 3 decades. "Riley can handle it." It took us almost 2 years of quiet, meticulous discipline to build the financial foundation for our trip. For 24 months, Miles and I operated with a shared, silent focus that felt less like saving for a vacation and more like funding an escape route. This anniversary was meant to be a milestone, a celebration of 7 years of marriage, but in our hearts, we both knew it was much more than that. It was the very first time we were doing something entirely, unapologetically for ourselves. We were not going to a luxury resort with gold-plated faucets or booking first-class seats. We were just going to Iceland. But to me, that barren, beautiful island represented a kind of freedom I had never allowed myself to taste. We opened a separate, joint savings account at a completely different bank, away from the accounts my parents had visibility into from my college days. We called it our Glacier Fund. Every single paycheck, a specific percentage vanished into that account before we even had the chance to look at it. We ruthlessly cut back on the small comforts that usually buffered the stress of our demanding jobs. We stopped our Friday night dinners at the little Italian place down the street. We brewed our own coffee every single morning, walking past the artisan cafes without a second glance. When the transmission on my aging sedan started slipping, I refused to trade it in for a newer model with a monthly payment. Instead, I paid a local mechanic a few $100s to patch it up, perfectly willing to drive a car with 150,000 miles on the odometer if it meant keeping our travel fund intact. We guarded the details of this trip with the paranoia of state secrets. I did not mention the savings account to my mother. I did not casually bring up flight prices around my father. I absolutely did not speak the word vacation anywhere near my brother. We had learned the hard way that in the Roberts family, any display of surplus resources, be it time, money, or joy, was immediately viewed as a communal asset waiting to be reallocated. 3 years prior, Miles and I had booked a modest 3-day weekend in a cabin upstate to celebrate his birthday. It was fully paid for, non-refundable. 2 days before we were supposed to drive up, Mason managed to get himself abruptly evicted from his apartment due to a sudden, catastrophic lapse in his rent payments. The family alarm sounded. My parents declared a state of emergency. I was expected to cancel our getaway, rent a moving truck with my own credit card, and spend my husband's birthday hauling my brother's cheap furniture out of a third-floor walk-up. When I hesitated, the guilt trip was so severe, so emotionally suffocating, that I caved. We lost the money for the cabin. We spent the weekend sweating in stairwells. Mason did not even buy us a pizza to say thank you. I swore to myself, and to Miles, that I would never let them steal our joy like that again. That ruined birthday weekend was a microcosm of our entire marriage up to that point. For 7 years, Miles had patiently shared his life with a woman who operated as a full-time emergency response team for people who refused to learn how to put out their own fires. Whenever my phone rang after 8 in the evening, the air in our living room would instantly grow heavy. We both knew my attention, my energy, and often our finances were about to be hijacked. I was constantly putting our marriage on standby to go resuscitate my family. Yet, Miles never issued an ultimatum. He never demanded I choose between him and my blood relatives. He is a man who understands that true boundaries cannot be forced upon someone. They have to be built from within. He would just hold my hand when I cried from exhaustion, and he would gently, consistently repeat a single phrase. "Help is voluntary, Riley," he would say, his voice a low, steady rumble in the quiet of our bedroom. "If they make it an obligation, if they demand it under the threat of withdrawal of their love, it is no longer help. It is a tax." Those words marinated in my mind for months. They became the lens through which I started viewing my entire existence. I began to deeply analyze the suffocating, heavy knot that formed in my stomach every time I did something purely for my own happiness. If I bought a nice winter coat, a voice in my head would whisper that the money could have covered Mason's utility bill. If I spent a Sunday afternoon reading a book instead of driving over to my parents' house to fix their wireless network, I felt a creeping sense of dread, waiting for the inevitable reprimand. I realized, with a profound and heartbreaking clarity, that this was not a moral compass. This was psychological conditioning. I had been trained, much like an animal, to associate my own independence with guilt. The family had successfully wired my brain to believe that choosing myself was an act of betrayal against them. Planning the Iceland trip became my quiet rebellion against that conditioning. We spent our evenings huddled over the kitchen island, a sprawling map of the country illuminated by the warm glow of the pendant lights. We were highly intentional about the itinerary. We did not want to rush from one tourist trap to another, adhering to a punishing, rigid schedule. We had enough rigidity in our daily lives. Instead, we designed a journey built around breathing room. We rented a rugged four-wheel drive vehicle to navigate the unpredictable terrain. We mapped out natural hot springs hidden in rugged valleys. We booked small, quiet guest houses in remote coastal towns where the population hovered around 300 people. The entire plan was a deliberate manifestation of the peaceful, unburdened life we were desperately trying to build for ourselves. One night, while confirming the reservation for a small cabin near the black sand beaches of Vik, I looked across the table at Miles. He was tracing a route along the southern coast with the back of a pen, a look of pure, unadulterated anticipation in his eyes. In that specific moment, watching the man who had stood quietly by my side through years of secondhand family trauma, I made a silent, unbreakable vow. I promised myself that this time, I would not yield. If the phone rang, I would not answer. If the house caught fire, they would have to call the fire department, not me. I was getting on that airplane. That quiet promise in the safety of our kitchen felt like a small, personal victory at the time, but it would soon become the very first boundary line drawn in a devastating war. We managed to keep the secret perfectly intact for nearly 23 months. We were in the home stretch, just a few weeks away from our departure date. I had started buying thermal base layers and waterproof boots, hiding the shopping bags in the back of my closet, but my newfound confidence made me careless. I let my guard down in the one place where I should have been wearing full armor. My parents' dining room. It was a standard, suffocating Sunday family dinner. The air was thick with the smell of roasted chicken and the underlying tension of Mason's latest financial complaint. I was exhausted from a long week at Alderaan, and my mental filters were running on low power. My father had asked a casual question about my workload, wondering if I would be available to help him review some confusing property tax documents at the end of the month. I took a sip of my water, my mind drifting to the map of the ring road. "I actually will not be around at the end of the month," I said, the words slipping out with an easy, practiced casualness. "Miles and I are taking some time off for our anniversary. We leave on the night of the 14th. The temperature in the dining room plummeted. The shift was so sudden and so violent it felt atmospheric. The clinking of silverware against porcelain ceased entirely. Mason paused with a piece of bread halfway to his mouth. My father slowly lowered his water glass. I looked across the table at my mother, Elaine. Her face remained perfectly composed. The polite maternal smile she wore for public appearances was still plastered across her mouth, tight and unmoving, but her eyes changed. The warmth vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating stillness. It was the look of a manager who had just been informed that a crucial, irreplaceable piece of machinery was going to be taken offline during peak production hours. She did not ask where we were going. She did not ask how long we would be gone. She did not offer a single word of congratulations for our 7 years of marriage. She just stared at me, the silence stretching out for 5 agonizing seconds, calculating the exact impact my absence would have on whatever disaster they were currently trying to hide. I had given them a specific date. The 14th, I had unknowingly handed them a hard deadline, and as I sat there, watching the cold arithmetic behind my mother's smile, a deep, primal instinct warned me that the storm was already gathering. The tension that settled over the dining room table was not loud or explosive. It was a quiet, suffocating pressure, the kind that builds in the atmosphere right before a violent thunderstorm breaks. Following the revelation of our departure date, the ambient noise of the Sunday dinner shifted. The cheerful clinking of silverware against porcelain felt suddenly forced, an artificial soundtrack masking the frantic calculations happening behind my family's eyes. I focused on my plate, cutting a piece of roasted potatoes with absolute, unnecessary precision, waiting for the first strike. It came from Mason, naturally. He leaned back in his oak dining chair, swirling the ice in his whiskey glass. A lazy, half-formed smile played on his lips, the kind of smile he wore when he was trying to figure out how much cash someone had in their wallet. "Iceland. Huh," Mason mused aloud, his tone carrying a synthetic layer of brotherly interest. "That is definitely a choice. I hear the exchange rate is brutal right now. What does a trip like that run a person these days?" "Total cost. I mean, when you factor in the flights and the fancy glacier tours." It was framed as a casual inquiry, the sort of harmless curiosity a sibling might naturally express. But I knew the translation. Mason did not care about the geopolitical economy of Nordic countries. He was running a mental appraisal. He wanted a concrete number. A number, to my brother, was merely a measure of my available liquidity. If I admitted we were spending a significant amount, he would immediately categorize that money as a surplus, a luxury I was selfishly hoarding while his own life remained a perpetual financial emergency. I placed my fork down, keeping my expression perfectly neutral. "We budgeted very carefully for it over a long period," I replied smoothly, offering him a blank wall instead of a window. "It is just nice to finally get away." Mason let out a short, nasal laugh, clearly irritated by the deflection. He leaned forward, ready to press the issue, to dig for the exact dollar amount. But my mother intervened. Elaine Roberts rarely raised her voice. She operated with the quiet, devastating efficiency of a seasoned interrogator. She reached out, adjusting a floral centerpiece that did not need adjusting, her eyes fixed entirely on the arrangement. "Going away for that long," my mother said, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet, maternal concern. "What if something happens at home?" The sentence was remarkably brief, yet it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken accusations. It was the ultimate, masterfully crafted guilt trip. She did not specify what could happen. She did not mention health scares, property damage, or financial ruin. She left the catastrophe intentionally vague, allowing my own conditioned anxiety to fill in the terrifying blanks. The implication was crystalline. I was the structural support beam of this family. If I removed myself from the premises, even for a brief celebration of my own marriage, and the roof inevitably caved in, the blood would be squarely on my hands. I felt a familiar, hot spike of defensive anger flare in my chest, but before I could formulate a polite rebuttal, my father cleared his throat. Warren Roberts was a man of few words, usually content to let his wife manage the emotional manipulation while he reaped the benefits of my compliance. He was staring at me from the head of the table, his brow furrowed in what looked like genuine concentration. "Riley," my father started, completely ignoring the tension my mother had just introduced into the room. "That old email address of yours, the personal one you used back in your 20s, before you moved over to your current company, do you still check that inbox?" The question was so jarring, so entirely disconnected from the current conversation about international travel, that I physically recoiled. I stared at him, my professional instincts instantly flaring to life. "My old webmail account," I asked, my voice cautious. "I suppose it is still active, but I never use it. Everything routes through my encrypted Alderaan servers or the joint account I share with Miles." "Why in the world would you ask about that specific address?" My father waved a thick, calloused hand dismissively, though his eyes darted away from mine for a fraction of a second. "Nothing important," he muttered, picking up his water glass. "I was just cleaning out the hard drive on the desktop computer upstairs. Found some old digital photographs from when you and Mason were teenagers. I thought I would send them over to you, but I only had that old address saved in my contacts." On the surface, it sounded like the mundane, technologically inept rambling of a man nearing retirement. But my father still referred to the internet as the World Wide Web. He still printed out step-by-step directions from mapping websites before driving to a new restaurant. He did not know how to clean out a hard drive, and he certainly did not spend his Sunday afternoons organizing nostalgic digital photo albums. My parents did not trade in nostalgia. They traded in leverage. The lie was so poorly constructed, so glaringly out of character, that it felt like a siren wailing in a silent room. I opened my mouth to press him further, to demand he tell me exactly why he was thinking about a dormant email account, but a sudden movement to my left caught my eye. It was Tessa, Mason's wife. Tessa was usually the diplomatic buffer in the Roberts family. She was a master at laughing off Mason's grandiosity and smoothing over the jagged edges of our family dinners. Tonight, however, she was a statue. She had barely touched her meal. Her hands rested in her lap, her knuckles white as she gripped the fabric of her skirt. I watched her from the corner of my eye. She kept shooting terrified, frantic glances at Mason, her mouth opening slightly as if she were desperately trying to interject, to stop a train from derailing. She looked like a hostage trying to signal the authorities without alerting her captor. Mason, entirely oblivious to his wife's silent panic, decided it was time to command the stage. He clapped his hands together, a sharp sound that made Tessa physically flinch. "Anyway, enough about vacations," Mason declared, his chest puffing out with that signature, unearned confidence. "You guys are going to want to hear this. I am officially locking in a massive distribution contract for North Peak Supply Company. It is going to put us in retail spaces across 3 major states by the 4th quarter. North Peak Supply Company was his latest phantom enterprise. I had vaguely heard him mention it a few months ago. Something to do with importing low-grade survival gear and rebranding it for suburban consumers. I had actively avoided asking follow-up questions. "That sounds ambitious," Miles said evenly from beside me. It was the first time my husband had spoken since the appetizers. His tone was perfectly polite, an impenetrable shield of civility. "It is more than ambitious, Miles. It is a done deal," Mason shot back, aggressively eager to prove his legitimacy. "The buyers love the prototype. We just have to scale up manufacturing. All we need right now is to finalize a quick round of bridge financing to cover the capital expenditure for the initial inventory turnover. Once the retail accounts receivable clear in 60 days, the short-term note vanishes, and we are operating on pure profit. I am an operations director. I spend 40 to 50 hours a week immersed in supply chain logistics, vendor contracts, and municipal funding structures. I know what competent financial planning sounds like. Mason sounded like a man who had memorized a dictionary of corporate buzzwords without understanding a single definition. The terms rolled off his tongue in a rapid, robotic sequence: bridge financing, capital expenditure, accounts receivable. He was not explaining a business model. He was reciting a script. And the desperate, feverish gleam in his eye told me he was reciting it to convince himself just as much as he was trying to convince us. The words bridge financing hung in the air, cold and heavy. Short term, high-interest capital designed to cover a temporary gap. The kind of aggressive financial maneuver that required collateral, substantial collateral. I looked at my mother, who was nodding along with Mason's empty promises as if he were delivering a sermon. I looked at my father, who was staring fixedly at his plate, avoiding my gaze entirely, and finally, I looked at Tessa. A single tear had welled up in the corner of her right eye, threatening to spill over. She refused to look at me. The sickness in my stomach crystallized into pure, undeniable dread. Something was fundamentally broken in this room. Something far more dangerous than simple entitlement. Miles shifted his weight beneath the table, his knee pressing firmly against mine. It was our silent, prearranged signal. Abort mission. We should probably get going, I announced suddenly, dropping my napkin onto my plate and pushing my chair back. I have an early morning site review tomorrow, and we still have a mountain of laundry to do before we pack. The protests from my parents were weak and perfunctory. Mason did not even bother to stand up as we gathered our coats. We walked out the front door, leaving the suffocating heat of the house for the crisp, biting air of the evening. The silence between Miles and me lasted until we were securely inside the car, the heavy doors slamming shut and insulating us from the world. Miles started the engine, the dashboard lights casting a soft, blue glow across his angular features. He did not put the car in drive immediately. He just gripped the steering wheel, staring straight out the windshield at the darkened suburban street. "They are going to call tomorrow night," Miles stated flatly, his voice devoid of any dramatic inflection. "I am absolutely certain. I bet 90%. I leaned my head against the cool glass of the passenger window, closing my eyes. "No," I whispered, desperately wanting to believe the fragile lie I was constructing in my own mind. "Mason is just posturing. He always does this when he feels insecure about his money, and my mother just hates losing control. It is just the usual drama. They will not ruin this trip. They know better." Miles finally shifted the car into gear, pulling away from the curb. "Riley," he said softly, "your father does not even know how to reset the router in his own living room, and yet he just spent dinner interrogating you about the active status of an email address you abandoned 8 years ago. They are not planning to ruin the trip. They are terrified of what you are going to find out before you leave." I did not have an argument to counter his logic. I spent the rest of the silent drive home staring at the passing streetlights, the knot of dread pulling tighter with every mile. Later that night, the house was perfectly quiet. Miles was already asleep, his breathing deep and even. I stood alone in the center of our bedroom, the harsh overhead light illuminating the open, empty suitcase on the floor. I moved methodically, a woman operating on autopilot. I folded a stack of thick wool sweaters. I placed my hiking boots in a plastic bag. I walked over to the wooden dresser, picked up my dark blue passport, and set it gently on the nightstand, right next to the suitcase. It was a physical manifestation of my boundary. I was leaving. I was going to see the glaciers. I was going to reclaim my own life. But as I stood there in the quiet sanctuary of my bedroom, surrounded by the gear for a trip that represented my freedom, I could not shake the cold, creeping sensation crawling up my spine. The image of Tessa's terrified face flashed behind my eyelids. Mason's hollow, robotic voice echoed in my ears, spouting terms like bridge financing and temporary liquidity. And beneath it all, playing on a relentless, terrifying loop, was my father's seemingly innocent question. "Do you still check that inbox?" I looked at my phone, resting innocently on the charging pad. It was quiet now. But I knew, with the terrifying certainty of a person watching the tide pull back right before a tsunami hits, that the silence was not going to last. The digital clock resting on my nightstand read 9:45 in the evening. Our suitcases stood at attention by the bedroom door, their zippers secured and luggage tags properly fastened. We had packed early, aiming for a peaceful, full night of sleep because our international flight to Keflavík was scheduled for the following evening, and I desperately wanted to cross the Atlantic with a clear head. The house was wrapped in a comforting, expectant silence, the kind of quiet that usually precedes a long-awaited adventure. Then, the silence violently shattered. My cell phone, resting face up on the wooden nightstand, began to vibrate with an angry, relentless intensity. The harsh buzzing sound against the wood felt like a physical intrusion into our sanctuary. I did not need to look at the bright screen to know who was disrupting the peace. Miles, who was quietly reading a paperback novel on his side of the bed, did not say a word. He simply lowered his book, marking the page with his finger, and met my eyes with a steady, knowing look. I reached out, my fingers inexplicably cold, and picked up the device. The screen boldly displayed my mother's name. I took a deep, shaky breath, bracing myself for the impact, and slid my thumb across the glass to accept the call. "Riley," Elaine's voice came rushing through the speaker before I could even say hello. It was pitched a full octave higher than her usual tone, vibrating with a frantic, nervous energy that she was desperately trying to disguise as casual, everyday annoyance. "Are you awake? I know you two are flying out tomorrow night, but we have a tiny temporary hiccup over here." I kept my eyes fixed on the ceiling. "What kind of hiccup?" "Mom?" I asked, keeping my voice entirely flat, refusing to feed into the manufactured panic she was trying to establish. "Oh, it is nothing major," she continued, her words tumbling over each other in a rushed, rehearsed cadence. "Just a small administrative delay with Mason's new inventory order. The wholesale supplier is being ridiculously stubborn about the short-term loan requirements. They need an extra layer of verification just to release the freight from the warehouse. It is entirely procedural, just red tape." She paused, taking a sharp, shallow breath, before launching the actual request. "We just need you to swing by the house tomorrow morning before you head to the airport. There is a simple support confirmation form that needs your signature. Or, honestly, to save you the drive and the hassle, Mason can just email you the secure link right now, and you can authorize an electronic signature from your phone while you are in bed. It will take 2 seconds. Riley, it will release the funds by tomorrow afternoon, and then you can go on your trip without worrying about your brother." The phrase support confirmation felt like a bucket of ice water pouring down my spine. The vague, sanitized terminology instantly triggered every single alarm bell in my operational brain. I sat up straight, the heavy comforter falling to my waist. "Sign in what capacity, Mom?" I asked, making sure to enunciate every single syllable with absolute clarity. "What exact legal document are you asking me to authorize the night before I leave the country?" "Do not use that cold, corporate tone with me, Riley," she snapped, the thin facade of casual annoyance cracking instantly to reveal the sheer desperation underneath. "It is just a family reference. Families guarantee each other all the time. Your father and I have already put our names down, but the underwriter wants someone with a more traditional corporate salary to smooth over their algorithm. It is just a formality. It does not mean anything." Before I could dissect the terrifying, legally binding word guarantee that she had just casually slipped into the conversation, the line clicked. A sharp beep echoed in my ear, signaling that a third person had been merged into the call. "Riley, listen to me." Mason's voice barged into the bedroom, loud, aggressive, and suffocatingly urgent. Mom is not explaining it right. She is making it sound worse than it is. It is a simple co-guarantee for 7 days. That is it. 7 days. The retail accounts receivable are already fully locked in. The cash flow is guaranteed by the buyers. I just need a financial bridge to get the physical boxes out of the holding facility. Once the retail money hits my business account on Thursday, your name automatically drops off the file. There is absolutely zero risk to you. He was speaking incredibly fast, a deliberate tactic designed to overwhelm my logical defenses with a barrage of financial jargon. But I was not a naive 20-something anymore, blindly trusting my older brother's grand visions. I managed municipal contracts worth millions of dollars. I knew exactly what a co-guarantee meant in the eyes of a lending institution. It meant that if his imaginary retail accounts failed to pay, or if the inventory was defective, or if he simply decided to use the funds to pay off a different debt, I would be legally, personally responsible for the entire balance of the loan. "Send me the document," I demanded, my voice hardening into an impenetrable wall of stone. "Send the entire contract, including the terms and conditions and the repayment schedule, to my email right now. I will forward it to my lawyer first thing in the morning. If she reviews it and says it is a harmless formality with zero liability, we can talk." Mason exploded. The sound of his fury distorted through the small speaker of my phone. "Are you out of your mind?" he shouted. "I do not have time for you to play corporate lawyer right now. Riley, the deadline is tomorrow at noon. If the funds do not clear by then, I lose the entire distribution deal. I lose the supplier. I lose everything. Why do you always have to make everything so incredibly complicated? Why can you not just do this one simple thing for your family when we need you?" The pressure building in my chest was immense, a heavy, crushing weight pressing against my ribs. 37 years of deep psychological conditioning screamed at me to surrender. Every instinct I had been taught since childhood urged me to apologize, to soothe his explosive anger, to open my laptop and blindly sign whatever document he needed, just to make the yelling stop. I physically felt the phantom weight of my parents' immense disappointment hovering over me. I looked over at Miles. He had closed his paperback entirely. He was not looking at the phone. He was looking directly at me. His expression was incredibly calm, yet fiercely, unwaveringly supportive. He did not shake his head or mouth any instructions. He just held my gaze, offering me a silent foundation of strength. I took a deep breath. I did not apologize. I did not try to soften the blow with excuses about my schedule. I did not offer an alternative solution or a compromise to keep the peace. "No," I said. The word felt incredibly strange in my mouth. It was sharp, unfamiliar, and entirely foreign to my vocabulary when speaking to my family, yet it felt incredibly, undeniably powerful. "I am not signing a co-guarantee for your business, Mason," I stated clearly, my voice ringing with a newfound authority. "I am not putting my name on your debt, and I am absolutely not canceling, delaying, or ruining my trip tomorrow to fix this." A heavy, stunned silence stretched over the cellular line for 3 agonizing seconds. Then, the emotional dam completely broke. "How can you be so incredibly selfish?" my mother wailed, her voice thick with sudden, weaponized tears. She shifted instantly from the negotiator to the victim. "After everything your father and I have done for you, your brother is on the verge of a massive breakthrough, and you are going to let him drown because you want to go look at some stupid icebergs. You are abandoning us. You are choosing a selfish vacation over your own flesh and blood. I am choosing not to be financially liable for a business I have no part in," I replied, my voice remarkably steady despite the massive surge of adrenaline coursing through my veins. "Good night, Mom. Good night, Mason." I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button, abruptly cutting off my mother's hysterical sobbing mid-sentence. The quiet that rushed back into the bedroom was deafening. My hands were shaking so violently that I almost dropped the sleek device onto the blanket. A fraction of a second later, the screen illuminated again with a sharp chime, signaling a new text message. It was from my father. "Warren." I opened the notification. There was no greeting. There was no explanation. There was no attempt at mediation or understanding. It was just a single, chillingly cold sentence typed in stark black text. Family comes first. It was the ultimate command, the foundational rule of the Roberts household, delivered not as a plea, but as a final, absolute warning. I stared at those 4 words glowing in the palm of my hand. For a brief, terrifying moment, the old Riley resurfaced. I felt an overwhelming, sickening urge to call them back, to surrender my boundaries, to beg for their forgiveness and ask where I needed to sign. But then I remembered the suspicious, calculating questions at the dinner table. I remembered Tessa's terrified eyes. I remembered the relentless, exhausting expectation that I would willingly bend myself out of shape just to keep my brother comfortable. I did not reply to my father. With trembling, determined fingers, I opened the settings menu on my phone. I tapped the icon to disable the cellular data. I tapped the icon to disable the wireless connection. Finally, I activated the airplane mode, ensuring that not a single call, text message, or notification could breach the digital walls of my sanctuary. The screen went dark, severing the connection entirely. I placed the dead phone face down on the nightstand, right next to my dark blue passport. I slid down under the heavy covers, the physical tremor in my hands slowly spreading to my chest as the adrenaline began to recede. Miles reached over, clicking off the bedside lamp and plunging the room into absolute darkness. He shifted closer, pulling me against his chest, wrapping his arms securely around my shaking shoulders. He did not ask if I was okay, and he did not offer any unsolicited advice. He just held me, lying there in the dark, listening to the steady, reassuring rhythm of my husband's heartbeat. The violent shaking finally began to subside. I had done it. For the very first time in my 37 years of life, I had looked at the raging, out-of-control fire of my family's dysfunction, and I had flatly refused to pick up a bucket of water. I had chosen my own peace, my own marriage, and my own financial security over the role of the perpetual, unappreciated fixer. It was a terrifying, monumental shift in the universe. I closed my eyes, feeling completely exhausted but oddly, profoundly resolute. I fell asleep in my husband's arms, completely unaware that my definitive refusal was not the end of the crisis, but merely the catalyst for a much darker, far more devastating betrayal that had already been set into motion. The sterile, fluorescent glow of the Keflavík International Airport baggage claim offered a jarring contrast to the dark, chaotic storm currently trapped inside my photo gallery. While my husband, Miles, stood by the slow-moving conveyor belt waiting for our 2 medium suitcases to appear, I sat on a hard metal bench, staring at the digital evidence I had just captured. My phone was safely back in airplane mode, completely disconnected from the cell towers, but the screenshots of the 43 missed calls and the overflowing notification banners felt radioactive in my hands. In my previous frantic scan upon landing, I had only absorbed the sheer volume of the assault. Now, in the brief lull before we picked up our rental car, I began to perform a morbid, meticulous autopsy on the messages my family had fired across the Atlantic. My mother had sent a rapid succession of text messages following her unhinged voicemail. I read them chronologically, noting the timestamps that marched relentlessly through the middle of the night back home. There was no inquiry about our transatlantic flight. There was no casual hope that we had landed safely. Her first text read, "You have completely ruined the timeline. You made everything worse by shutting off your phone." The second arrived 20 minutes later. "Your brother is literally hyperventilating in the kitchen because of your stubbornness." The third was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive manipulation. "I hope your vacation is worth the permanent damage you are doing to this family today." I let out a dry, bitter laugh that echoed slightly in the cavernous arrival hall. It was almost impressive how consistently she managed to cast me as the villain. I was standing on a foreign island, having done absolutely nothing but refuse to sign a mysterious document, yet I was somehow responsible for Mason's respiratory distress. Then, I opened the text thread from my father, Warren. My father rarely texted. When he did, It usually involved single-word answers or confusing emojis sent out of context. But today, his messages read like lines from a low-budget mafia movie. The most recent one, sent just an hour before we touched down, was chillingly brief. Call back immediately, before someone else calls you. That specific phrasing made the hairs on my arms stand up. Before someone else calls you. He was not worried about my relationship with my brother. He was worried about outside interference. He was trying to intercept me. My thumb moved to Mason's thread. My older brother had abandoned any pretense of asking for a favor and had launched straight into a desperate, raging defensive posture. His final text, delivered in a solid block of furious capitalization, was the most revealing piece of the puzzle so far. He wrote, "They are threatening to pull the funding entirely because you went dark on us. If you just signed the paper like a normal family member, this would be done by now. I already told the underwriter you were on board. You are making me look like a liar." I read that sentence 3 times. I already told the underwriter you were on board. The audacity was breathtaking, but it also exposed a massive structural flaw in his plan. Mason had sold my participation to a lending institution before he had even presented the idea to me. He had used my name, my supposed corporate salary, and my immaculate credit history as collateral to secure a promise of funding, assuming he could simply bully me into formalizing the arrangement at the 11th hour. When I said no and turned off my device, his entire house of cards collapsed in front of the loan officers. But the true horror, the detail that fundamentally shifted the ground beneath my feet, was waiting in a text message from the unknown corporate number. I had listened to their voicemail earlier, the one demanding guarantor verification, but the automated text message they had sent parallel to the call contained a slightly different vocabulary. It read, "Urgent borrower verification required for Meridian Crest Capital. Guarantee extension pending final signature. Failure to respond within 24 hours will trigger default clauses on the active account." I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. I stared at the word extension. You cannot extend a contract that does not exist. You cannot trigger a default clause on an account that has not already been opened, funded, and established. In my professional life at Alderon Civic Systems, I deal with contract renewals and financial extensions on a weekly basis. An extension implies a pre-existing legal obligation. If Meridian Crest Capital was looking for my signature to authorize a guarantee extension, it meant they firmly believed I was already a guarantor on the original loan. The pieces of the puzzle began to violently snap together in my mind, forming a picture so ugly I felt physically nauseous. My name was already on a file I had never seen. Miles walked over, effortlessly rolling our 2 suitcases behind him. He handed me a steaming paper cup of black coffee he had purchased from a nearby kiosk. He sat down next to me on the cold metal bench, his large presence immediately grounding my racing thoughts. He looked at the glowing screen of my phone, then looked at my face, reading the fresh horror in my eyes. He did not demand to see the phone. He did not tell me what to do or try to take over the situation. Miles operates like a highly trained incident commander. He simply observed the panic and offered a structured path forward. "We need to organize the data before we leave the airport," Miles said quietly, his tone steady and practical. "We have the screenshots of the texts. Have you checked the rest of the voicemails? We should save the audio files to a secure cloud folder we both share, just in case the phone gets lost or damaged. Then we log the timestamps on a spreadsheet. We treat this exactly like a project failure at work. Document everything, react to nothing yet." His calm, methodical approach was a lifeline. I took a sip of the bitter, scalding coffee and nodded. "There is one voicemail left," I told him, my voice trembling slightly. "It is from Tessa, which is strange, because Tessa never calls me directly during a family crisis. She usually just stays quiet and tries to survive the blast radius." "Play it," Miles suggested, leaning in closer so he could hear the audio over the ambient noise of the baggage claim. I tapped the play button on Tessa's message. The audio quality was poor, filled with a hollow, echoing background noise, as if she were hiding in a tiled bathroom or a laundry room. Her voice was not merely anxious. It was laced with genuine, unfiltered terror. "Riley, it is me," Tessa whispered hurriedly into the receiver. She sounded breathless, pausing every few seconds as if listening for footsteps outside a door. "Listen to me carefully. Do not call Mason first. Whatever Warren and Elaine tell you today, do not agree to anything over the phone. Please, Riley, I cannot say much right now, but please, just check your old email. Check the webmail account your dad was asking about at dinner. Please." The line went dead with a sharp click. I sat frozen on the bench, the cold Icelandic draft swirling around my ankles, suddenly feeling much less significant than the ice in my veins. Check your old email. The webmail account I had not actively used in over 8 years. The account my father had bizarrely inquired about during our tense Sunday dinner, claiming he wanted to send vintage digital photographs. The narrative in my head underwent a massive, terrifying paradigm shift. The 43 missed calls were not the frantic flailing of a family throwing a temper tantrum because I refused to be their financial savior. They were the desperate, coordinated actions of people trying to cover up a crime. They needed me to quickly, blindly sign an extension to retroactively legitimize a signature they had already forged. They were trying to outrun the underwriter's verification process. This was no longer a story about an overbearing mother or an entitled, foolish older brother. This was no longer family drama. This was potential financial fraud, identity theft, and forgery, orchestrated by my own blood relatives. "Okay," Miles said, breaking the heavy silence. He took my empty coffee cup and tossed it into a nearby recycling bin. He looked at me with an expression of profound resolve. "Do you want to turn the data back on and call your lawyer right now? We can sit right here in the terminal. I will handle the rental car paperwork while you make the calls." I looked at my watch. It was still the middle of the night back in the United States. Calling my attorney now would only result in leaving a chaotic voicemail of my own. Furthermore, I was exhausted, emotionally battered, and operating on zero sleep. If I engaged now, I would be fighting on their terms, reacting to their panic. I looked down at my phone, secured in airplane mode, a silent black rectangle holding the evidence of my family's betrayal. Then I looked up at the large glass windows of the terminal. Outside, the sky was a bruised, magnificent gray. The landscape was utterly foreign, a sprawling expanse of jagged volcanic rock covered in patches of brilliant green moss, completely indifferent to the petty, toxic disasters of human beings. We had traveled thousands of miles to stand on this remote, beautiful island. "No," I said, my voice finally losing its tremor, replaced by a cold, hardened clarity. "I am keeping the phone completely disconnected for another 24 hours. We are going to pick up the rental car. We are going to drive to the coast, check into our cabin, and sleep. I need a perfectly clear head before I open that old email account. I need to be entirely rested before I declare war." Miles smiled, a sharp, approving expression. He stood up, grabbing the handles of our luggage. "Good plan. Let us get out of here." We walked out of the sliding glass doors of the terminal and stepped directly into the biting, pristine air of the Icelandic morning. The wind whipped around us, fierce and clean, carrying the faint, salty scent of the northern ocean. I zipped my heavy coat up to my chin, staring out at the stark, uncompromising horizon. For decades, I had operated under the assumption that the worst my family could do was waste my time, drain my bank account, and exhaust my empathy. I thought the damage was limited to ruined weekends and unappreciated favors. But as I stood there, shivering in the shadow of a foreign landscape, I finally understood the brutal truth. There are certain types of families that will not stop at demanding your time. They will not stop at taking your money. If you do not draw a permanent line in the sand, if you do not actively fight back, they will take your very identity and use it to build their own comfortable lies. I took one last look at my phone before shoving it deep into my coat pocket. Let them panic. Let them sweat through the night, staring at their phones, waiting for the obedient daughter to call back and fix their mess. I was done fixing things. When I finally turned my phone back on, I was going to burn their entire house of cards to the ground. We landed back on American soil on a Tuesday afternoon. The jet lag from the transatlantic journey was a dull, throbbing ache behind my eyes, but the knot of anxiety sitting heavy in my stomach was infinitely sharper. The moment we retrieved our bags and stepped into the bustling arrivals hall of the international terminal, I pulled my phone from my coat pocket and disabled the airplane mode. I did not listen to the voicemails. I did not read the backlog of text messages. I simply opened the family group chat and typed a brief, sterile message stating that Miles and I had returned safely and were heading home. The replies rolled in over the next few hours as we navigated the highway traffic back to our house. My mother responded with a single, generic thumbs-up icon. My father did not respond at all. Mason, however, could not resist the opportunity to seize the narrative. "Glad you had fun," his text message read, the passive aggression practically dripping from the screen. I had to jump through burning hoops, liquidate a huge chunk of my personal savings, and beg the supplier for mercy, but I managed to save the North Peak contract. No thanks to you. Because of you, I almost lost everything. Hope the icebergs were worth it. I read his message, scoffed quietly, and tossed the phone onto the kitchen counter. They were aggressively sticking to their established script. I was the selfish, ungrateful daughter who had abandoned her family in their hour of need, and Mason was the resilient, unfairly persecuted martyr who had heroically salvaged his own business. I let them have their narrative. I did not engage. I needed a shower and 12 hours of uninterrupted sleep. By Friday, my life had settled securely back into its rigid corporate rhythm at Alderaan Civic Systems. I spent the morning realigning a massive municipal budget and the afternoon putting out logistical fires with a software vendor. Surrounded by spreadsheets and project timelines, I felt a false sense of security settling over me. The chaos of my family felt neatly compartmentalized, tucked away in a box I simply refused to open. Then, I came home from the office. Miles was standing in the foyer, his briefcase resting on the floor beside him. He was holding a stiff white cardboard envelope. A bright green sticker ran across the top border. Certified mail. Return receipt requested. He handed it to me without a single word, his gray eyes dark with concern. I looked at the return address printed in crisp, black ink in the top left corner, Meridian Crest Capital. My heart executed a violent, heavy drop into my chest. I carried the stiff envelope to the kitchen island, grabbed a pair of metal shears from the drawer, and sliced the top edge open. I pulled out a thick stack of stapled papers. The header on the first page read, "Commercial Guarantee Agreement" in bold, capitalized letters. I bypassed the dense paragraphs of legal jargon and scanned directly down to the names of the involved parties. Borrower, North Peak Supply Company. Guarantor, Riley Roberts. I flipped frantically to the very last page of the packet. There, sitting starkly on the designated signature line, was a digital stamp bearing my full legal name. I looked at the timestamp printed next to the electronic signature. It was not dated from the night before my trip. It was dated 6 entire months ago. My breath caught painfully in my throat. I turned to the second document included in the mailing. It was a single page titled Guarantee Extension and Verification Request. I checked the timestamp on this second form. It was dated the exact day I was scheduled to board my flight to Keflavík. For a terrifying moment, the kitchen spun around me. The sheer, staggering scale of the violation was incomprehensible. They had not just tried to trick me into signing a last-minute favor before I left the country. They had already forged my consent half a year prior. They had attached my identity, my immaculate credit score, and my financial future to Mason's doomed business venture while I was sitting at Sunday dinners, completely oblivious. I stared at the thick stack of paper, waiting for the hysterical tears to come. I waited for the overwhelming urge to scream, to throw my ceramic coffee mug against the wall, to collapse onto the hardwood floor in a fit of betrayed agony. But the tears never materialized. The panic simply vanished. Instead, a profound, icy calm washed over my entire body. I did not feel like a heartbroken daughter anymore. I felt exactly like an operations director assessing a critical, catastrophic security breach. I walked straight into my home office, sat down at my desk, and opened my laptop. Within 20 minutes, I had placed a hard security freeze on my credit files across all 3 major reporting bureaus. I changed the administrative passwords to my bank accounts, my retirement funds, and my primary email address, activating 2-factor authentication on every single platform. Then, I picked up my phone and started making professional inquiries. On Monday morning, I sat in a sleek, glass-walled conference room in the downtown financial district. Across the polished mahogany table sat Nora Kincaid, a fiercely intelligent civil litigator who specialized in corporate financial fraud, and Gavin Pike, an independent digital forensics analyst whom Nora kept on permanent retainer. I slid the certified documents from Meridian Crest Capital across the table. Gavin picked up the papers, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he studied the digital stamps. Electronic signature platforms are incredibly secure, Gavin explained, his voice a low, gravelly hum. But that security works both ways. They leave a massive, indelible digital footprint. Every single time a document is opened, reviewed, signed, or forwarded, the software creates an audit trail. It logs the Internet Protocol address, the exact geographic location, the specific device type, the time down to the millisecond, and the exact email address used for the final authentication. I reached into my bag and handed Gavin a small silver flash drive. It contained the complete forwarding headers from the webmail account my father had so desperately asked about during our last dinner. Tessa had been absolutely right. I had logged into that old, dormant account the day we returned from Iceland. Sitting right there in the primary inbox, flagged as read and filed away in an archive folder, were the original signature routing links from Meridian Crest Capital, sent 6 months ago. It took Gavin exactly 48 hours to extract and analyze the complete metadata from the electronic signature audit trail. When Nora called me on Wednesday afternoon with the preliminary results, her tone was strictly business, entirely devoid of any gentle bedside manner. The electronic signature applied to the original commercial guarantee 6 months ago was authenticated using your old webmail address, Nora stated flatly over the phone. The Internet Protocol address logged at the exact moment of the signing belongs to a residential Internet service provider. Gavin cross-referenced the geographic coordinates. It traces directly back to the wireless router located at your parents' house. Furthermore, the device signature matches a desktop computer running an outdated operating system. I closed my eyes, pressing the phone hard against my ear. My father's desktop computer, the one he kept in his upstairs den, the exact machine he claimed he was cleaning out to find vintage family photographs. The puzzle pieces locked together with a sickening, devastating precision. The 43 missed calls while I was flying over the Atlantic Ocean, the hysterical, breathless voicemails from my mother, the aggressive text messages from my father demanding I check my email immediately. They were not calling to desperately guilt me into securing a new loan for Mason. They were calling in a state of absolute blind panic because Meridian Crest Capital required a final secondary verification from the guarantor to process the extension on the credit line. They needed me to unknowingly click the authorization link before the underwriter flagged the file and realized the guarantor was completely unaware of the massive debt sitting in her name. If I had answered the phone that night, if I had caved to my mother's weaponized tears and blindly clicked the link they sent to authorize a simple family reference, I would have inadvertently ratified a 6-month-old forgery. I would have legally bound myself to the fraud, making it nearly impossible to untangle my name from Mason's impending bankruptcy. I thanked Nora for the update, instructed her to begin drafting the necessary legal notices, and hung up the phone. I sat in the utter silence of my home office, watching the afternoon sun filter through the blinds. A normal person, upon discovering this level of familial betrayal, would have driven straight to their parents' suburban home and kicked the front door off its hinges. A normal daughter would have marched into their living room, slammed the certified documents onto the coffee table, screamed until her vocal cords shredded, and demanded a tearful explanation. But I was no longer interested in their explanations. They had ruthlessly weaponized my competence, my reliability, and my deep sense of obligation for decades. Now, they were going to experience exactly what that terrifying competence looked like when it was aimed directly at their throats. I made a very conscious, incredibly cold decision right there in my office chair. I was not going to blow up their phones with accusations. I was not going to send a furious, emotionally charged text message demanding justice. I was going to let them believe that my current silence was nothing more than an extended sulk over the drama surrounding my vacation. I would let my father believe his lie about the email address had worked. I would let my mother think I was just being a stubborn, ungrateful child. I would let them relax, thinking they had successfully dodged a massive bullet and gotten away with identity theft. Let them sleep soundly. Let Mason spend the fraudulently obtained funds. Let my parents pat themselves on the back for once again protecting their golden boy from the consequences of his own actions. Because while they were busy playing family, I was going to quietly, methodically, and ruthlessly build an airtight legal vault around them. I was going to strip away every single defense they had. I would gather the IP logs, the time-stamped boarding passes, the webmail access records, and the forensic analysis. I was not going to just prove they were wrong. I was going to construct a scenario where they had absolutely no choice but to surrender on my exact terms, or face a federal indictment. I smiled, a tight, humorless expression in the quiet room. The designated crisis manager was officially off the clock, and the executioner had just clocked in. The text message from Tessa arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, sent from a burner application rather than her actual cellular number. It contained only an address for an independent coffee shop located 3 towns over from my parents' suburban neighborhood, followed by a desperate plea for 20 minutes of my time. I arrived early, taking a seat in a dark corner booth facing the entrance. When Tessa walked through the glass door, I barely recognized my own sister-in-law. She looked entirely hollowed out. Her usually pristine blonde hair was pulled back into a messy, uneven knot, and dark, heavy circles bruised the skin under her eyes. She ordered a plain black tea, her hands trembling so violently that the cup rattled against the saucer when she set it down on our small wooden table. For the past week, I had firmly categorized Tessa as a silent, complicit accessory to my brother's crimes, but as she sat across from me, radiating sheer, unadulterated exhaustion, that assumption began to crumble. "I only have about 45 minutes before Mason expects me back at the house," Tessa whispered, keeping her eyes fixed on her tea. "He thinks I am at the pharmacy. Riley, you have to understand something. The North Peak Supply Company is not a real business anymore. It is a massive, collapsing shell game." I leaned forward, my corporate instincts immediately taking over. "Explain the shell game, Tessa." She took a shaky breath. "Mason has been taking catastrophic losses for 8 straight months. He lost his primary investor back in January. Since then, he has been surviving by illegally rotating funds. He takes the order processing fees from new clients and immediately uses that cash to pay off the furious wholesale vendors from his last failed project. He is using high-interest, short-term microloans to cover the minimum payments on massive corporate credit cards. It is an absolute nightmare. The bridge financing he talked about at dinner was not for expansion. It was a desperate attempt to stop 3 different suppliers from filing lawsuits against him. I processed the terrifying reality of his financial rot. "And my name?" I asked, my voice deadly calm. "How long have you known that my name was on the Meridian Crest Capital file?" Tessa finally looked up, her eyes brimming with tears. "I saw a draft of the paperwork sitting on his desk 6 months ago. I saw your name listed as the primary guarantor. I lost my mind. Riley." I screamed at him. I told him he could not drag you into his mess, but Mason swore to me that he had not done it behind your back. He sat me down and looked me right in the eye. He said Warren and Elaine had gone to you privately, that they had explained the situation, and that you had willingly agreed to be a silent financial backer to save the family from public embarrassment. She wiped a tear from her cheek. "He told me you explicitly wanted to keep it a secret from Miles, so it would not cause friction in your marriage." It sounded exactly like the kind of twisted, sacrificial thing your parents would ask you to do, and it sounded exactly like the kind of thing you would agree to just to keep the peace. I believed him. Until the dinner before your trip, when Warren started asking about your old email address, that was when I realized they were lying. That was when I realized they had stolen your identity. I sat back in the booth, absorbing the absolute, chilling perfection of Mason's lie. He had weaponized my well-documented history of cleaning up his messes to convince his own wife that his forgery was actually just another one of my standard family rescues. I left the coffee shop feeling a strange, dark sense of validation. I was no longer fighting shadows. I was fighting a highly organized, desperate criminal enterprise. As I walked to my car, my phone buzzed in my coat pocket. It was a message from Cousin Brooke. Brooke was the official black sheep of our extended family, a title she earned by dropping out of a prestigious university to become a tattoo artist in a different state. My parents despised her independence. I had always secretly admired it. I opened her message. There was no greeting, just 4 image files. They were screenshots taken directly from the Roberts Extended Family Group Chat, a digital gathering place that I had quietly muted 5 years ago. I zoomed in on the first image. My Aunt Susan had asked a benign question about how Mason's new business venture was progressing. The reply from my mother, Elaine, was a masterclass in psychological warfare. "We are just praying for him constantly," my mother had typed to an audience of 24 relatives. "It has been an incredibly difficult week." Riley decided to take a wildly expensive, extravagant vacation right at the exact moment Mason needed a simple, 5-minute paperwork favor to secure his inventory. She completely refused to help him. It has been so heartbreaking for Warren and me to watch her abandon her own brother when he is working so hard. We are just trying to pick up the pieces she left behind. I stared at the glowing screen, a cold smile pulling at the corners of my mouth. This was not merely a mother venting her frustrations. This was a highly calculated, preemptive smear campaign. Elaine knew exactly what they had done to me. She knew that if I eventually discovered the forged loan and went public, the fallout would destroy them. So, she was systematically salting the earth. She was building a narrative where I was a selfish, vindictive, wealthy sister who was actively trying to ruin her struggling brother out of pure spite. If I cried fraud, the extended family would simply roll their eyes and dismiss it as my ongoing, petty vendetta against Mason. I saved the screenshots to my secure cloud folder. The evidence pile was growing. The next morning, the evidence escalated from family gossip to federal offenses. I was sitting in my home office when Nora Kincaid, my attorney, initiated a secure video conference. Gavin Pike, the digital forensics analyst, was dialed in alongside her. "We completed the secondary extraction on the Meridian Crest Capital file," Gavin announced, skipping the pleasantries entirely. "Specifically, we analyzed the digital footprint of the guarantee extension request, the document that was supposedly sent to your old webmail address on the day of your flight." "What did you find?" I asked, pulling up a blank digital notepad. The extension request was officially opened, electronically signed, and submitted back to the lender at exactly 2:14 in the morning, Eastern Standard Time. Gavin stated, "I checked my meticulously documented travel itinerary. At 2:14 in the morning on that specific date, I was sitting in seat 14B, approximately 30,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, with my phone completely disabled. It was a physical impossibility for me to have executed that signature. Furthermore," Gavin continued, his voice a steady, clinical drone, "the Internet Protocol address and the Media Access Control address for the device used to submit the forged extension perfectly match the desktop computer located in your parents' residential network. They panicked when you turned your phone off, so they simply logged into your old webmail from their own house and forged your consent a second time." I nodded slowly, documenting the timestamps. "Okay. That proves they forged the extension. But what about the original loan from 6 months ago? Mason could argue he did that from a coffee shop and just used their internet for the extension." Nora leaned forward into her camera frame, her expression grim. "That brings us to the second discovery. In order to approve a commercial guarantee of this magnitude 6 months ago, the underwriter required hard proof of the guarantor's income. A simple credit check was not enough. They required tax documentation. A cold, heavy rock formed in the pit of my stomach. What did they provide? The lender's server logs show an uploaded document attached to your guarantor profile. Nora explained. We subpoenaed the file. It is a scanned, full-color copy of your W-2 tax form from exactly 4 years ago. It lists your Alderaan Civic System salary, your social security number, and your permanent address. The breath left my lungs in a sudden, violent rush. When Miles and I moved into our current house 3 years ago, we aggressively downsized. I had taken 2 large plastic storage bins filled with my old college records, outdated medical files, and early career tax returns, and placed them in the basement storage closet of my parents' house. I had meant to retrieve them eventually, but the demands of my job had pushed the chore down my priority list. Mason was pathologically lazy. He did not know where the spare toilet paper was kept in that house, let alone my archived financial documents. But my father, Warren, was entirely different. My father was a man who spent his weekends meticulously organizing his garage tools by size and labeling file folders with a label maker. He was the sole keeper of the basement storage key. My father did not just turn a blind eye to Mason's fraud. He was not just passively sitting at the dining room table asking suspicious questions about email addresses. Warren Roberts had physically walked down the basement stairs, unlocked the storage closet, dug through my personal plastic bins, retrieved a highly sensitive federal tax document, and handed my identity over to his son to be slaughtered. The realization was a physical blow. The patriarch of the family, the man who constantly preached that family comes first, was the primary architect of my financial execution. On Thursday evening, the architect's son finally lost his patience. My cell phone rang, displaying Mason's name. I let it ring 3 times, took a deep breath to center my heart rate, and pressed answer, simultaneously activating the recording software on my secondary tablet. Are you done throwing your little tantrum yet? Mason demanded. There was no hello. There was absolutely zero remorse in his voice. He sounded entirely exasperated, like a busy executive dealing with an incompetent intern. I am not sure what you mean, Mason, I replied, keeping my tone intentionally bland and unreadable. He let out a sharp, aggressive sigh. Do not play stupid. Riley, I got an automated email from Meridian Crest today. They said there is a temporary administrative hold on the account pending a secondary manual verification from the guarantor. Did you call them? Did you try to freeze the funds just to punish me for the other night? He still believed he was in control. He genuinely believed that my anger was just a temporary emotional hurdle he could bulldoze his way through. He had absolutely no idea that I already possessed the IP logs, the timestamps, and the W-2 records. I have not spoken to anyone at Meridian Crest, I said truthfully. My lawyer had filed the injunctions, not me. Good, Mason snapped, because the retail cash hits my account next Wednesday. Once that happens, the short-term note clears, and this entire stupid drama is over. But honestly, Riley, how far are you going to take this silent treatment? You are acting like a lunatic over a simple piece of paper. You need to stop playing the victim and grow up. He did not apologize for stealing my name. He did not beg for my forgiveness for forging a federal document. He was solely furious that my reaction was inconveniencing his schedule. I will keep that in mind. Mason, I said quietly, and terminated the call. I sat in the dark living room, the glowing screen of the recording tablet illuminating my face. The puzzle was complete. The evidence was secured. The trap was fully loaded and the safety was off. But the universe, it seemed, had one final, agonizing twist to deliver. Early Friday morning, my phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. It was a private call from my mother. I almost let it go to voicemail, assuming it was just another calculated guilt trip for the family archives, but a strange instinct made me answer. Hello? There was no immediate barrage of accusations. There was no passive-aggressive sigh. Instead, I heard the jagged, ugly sound of someone struggling to breathe. "Riley," Elaine gasped, her voice thick and wet with genuine, uncontrollable sobbing. It was a sound I had never heard her make in my entire 37 years of life. My mother never lost her composure. She used tears as weapons. Neat and delicate, this was raw. This was the sound of a woman completely breaking apart. "Mom, what is wrong?" I asked, my guard instantly rising. "I did not know." She wept, the words pouring out of her in a frantic, broken stream. "I swear to God, Riley, I did not know what they actually did. Mason told me he just needed you to vouch for his character over the phone. I thought you were just refusing to make a 5-minute phone call. I swear to you, I did not know your father went into your basement boxes. I did not know they signed your name while you were on that airplane. I just found the folder in Warren's desk. Riley, I am so sorry. I am so incredibly sorry." I stood perfectly still in the center of my kitchen, the morning sunlight washing over the hardwood floors. I listened to my mother, the great enabler, the woman who had spent decades demanding I sacrifice my life for her golden boy, completely fall to pieces over the realization of what her husband and son had truly become. A profound, heavy silence stretched between us across the cellular line. Did I believe her? Did I believe that the mastermind of the Roberts family had actually been kept in the dark about a felony conspiracy happening under her own roof? I was not entirely sure. But as I listened to her hyperventilate, I realized one crucial, game-changing fact. For the very first time in my life, the impenetrable, toxic united front of my family had completely shattered. They were turning on each other. "I have to go." "Mom," I said softly, and hung up the phone. The investigation was officially closed. It was time to set the table for the final dinner. The official summons arrived on a Sunday morning. It did not come in the form of a frantic phone call, a desperate voicemail, or an unannounced visit. Instead, it was a carefully sanitized, highly calculated text message dropped into the family group chat by my father. "We need to sit down and talk this through," Warren wrote, his digital tone completely masking the active felonies currently sitting under his roof. "Your mother is making a roast for dinner on Tuesday night at 7 o'clock. We all need to clear the air and get back on the same page as a family." Clear the air. It was a fascinating, entirely delusional choice of words. They were treating a massive, coordinated financial crime like a minor disagreement over holiday scheduling. I knew exactly what this dinner was designed to be. It was a staged reconciliation, a heavily orchestrated environment where they would attempt to surround me, apply the familiar, suffocating pressure of familial duty, and slide a retroactive confirmation form across the table for me to sign under extreme duress. They honestly believed they could guilt me into saving Mason from impending federal fraud charges. I did not ignore the message, nor did I allow them to sweat for days. I responded exactly 12 minutes later, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. "I will be there," I typed, ensuring every word was deliberate. "I am coming alone. I will bring the files." I hit send, and watched the small read receipts pop up one by one beneath my message. There was no reply. I could practically feel the collective, terrified holding of breath radiating from their suburban house across the city. The addition of those final 4 words was perfectly polite, yet it functioned as a psychological tripwire, signaling that the rules of engagement had fundamentally changed. I spent the entirety of Monday afternoon preparing for the confrontation. My attorney, Nora Kincaid, did not deal in emotional closure or family healing. She dealt strictly in leverage and undeniable facts. Sitting in her sleek, high-rise office overlooking the downtown financial district, she outlined 2 extremely distinct, brutal paths forward. "Path A is the civil settlement," Nora explained, sliding a thick, professionally bound document across her polished mahogany desk. "It is an airtight, legally binding agreement with incredibly strict conditions. It allows your family to avoid federal prison and public ruin, but it completely strips them of their power and their assets. Path B is the nuclear option. If they refuse to sign Path A, or if they attempt to deny the reality of the situation at that dinner table, I will personally file the comprehensive evidence package with the financial authorities and initiate a massive civil lawsuit first thing on Wednesday morning. It is entirely their choice to make. We spent hours constructing the specific conditions for the civil settlement. I was not interested in an apology. Apologies in the Roberts family were just counterfeit currency used to buy more time and evade consequences. I demanded a package of absolute, unyielding accountability. First, the settlement required a formal, written admission of guilt from both Mason and my father, detailing exactly how they accessed my personal information, intercepted my mail, and forged my electronic signature. Second, it mandated the immediate, permanent withdrawal of any and all financial requests, loan applications, and credit inquiries tied to my legal name. Third, and perhaps the most painful condition for my brother's inflated ego, the contract included a legally enforced liquidation plan. Mason was required to sell his non-essential assets to pay off the fraudulent debt he had accumulated. That meant his expensive recreational vehicle, his high-end mountain bikes, and his leased luxury sedan were all going on the market immediately. The proceeds would be locked into a strict installment plan managed by a third-party escrow service, ensuring I never had to collect a dime from him personally. Furthermore, I mandated a formal retraction. Mason was legally required to draft and send a letter of correction to the entire extended family network. He had to explicitly admit that he had lied about my lack of support and confess to his own gross financial mismanagement. The vicious smear campaign my mother had started on the group chat was going to be publicly dismantled by her own golden child, but the final, most crucial condition of the entire package rested squarely on my father's shoulders. Both Warren and Mason had to sign a permanent, legally binding pledge forbidding them from ever accessing, utilizing, or storing any of my personal identification documents in the future. To enforce this, I demanded that the entirety of my archived paperwork, the heavy plastic bins currently locked in their basement storage closet, be physically handed over to me before I walked out of their front door on Tuesday night. With the settlement perfectly drafted, I turned my attention to the weapon I would carry into their dining room. For my entire career at Alderaan Civic Systems, I have built operational dossiers designed to withstand the most brutal municipal audits. I applied that exact same rigorous, emotionless methodology to my own family. I purchased a heavy black leather portfolio. Inside, I arranged the evidence with surgical precision. The first section contained the timeline of the forgery, supported by my official flight itinerary, the airline boarding confirmation, and a high-resolution photograph of me standing at the departure gate in Keflavík, complete with a verified digital timestamp proving I was thousands of miles away when the guarantee extension was submitted. The second section housed Gavin Pike's devastating forensic analysis. It included the Internet Protocol logs, the media access control addresses tracing the specific device back to my parents' home router, and the metadata from the old webmail account. It was not a loose collection of angry accusations. It was a reinforced wall of irrefutable, mathematical facts. When Tuesday evening finally arrived, the atmosphere in my own house was charged with a quiet, focused energy. Miles stood in our kitchen, leaning against the granite counter, watching me meticulously check the contents of the black portfolio one last time. I had made the deliberate, strategic decision to go to the dinner completely alone, and Miles fully supported the logic behind it. We both knew the Roberts family playbook intimately. If my husband walked through that front door with me, my parents would instantly weaponize his presence. They would aggressively deflect their own immense guilt by pointing a finger at him, claiming he was the controlling, manipulative outsider who had brainwashed their daughter and turned her against her own flesh and blood. They would use him as a convenient scapegoat to avoid looking at their own horrific reflections. I was removing their favorite target from the board entirely. "I am going to drive separate," Miles said, his voice a steady, comforting anchor in the tense room. "I will park at the 24-hour diner 3 blocks away from their house. I will order a black coffee and leave my phone sitting face up on the table. If things go sideways, if they start screaming, or if you just decide you have had enough after 5 minutes of their nonsense, you send me a single text message. I will be idling in their driveway in less than 60 seconds to pull you out. It was a small logistical detail, but it was an incredibly profound act of love. He was not trying to fight my battle for me, treating me like a fragile victim, nor was he abandoning me to the wolves. He was simply acting as my secure extraction team, ensuring I had absolute power and control over my own environment. I reached out and squeezed his hand, drawing immense strength from his quiet, unwavering solidarity. I walked into our bedroom to get dressed. Usually, when attending a family function, I wore soft sweaters, comfortable denim, and accommodating, polite smiles. I unconsciously dressed to blend in, to shrink myself down so I would not accidentally cast a shadow over my brother's fragile ego or trigger my mother's competitive nature. Tonight, I dressed for a corporate execution. I pulled a sharp, tailored black blazer from my closet, pairing it with structured, wide-leg trousers and a crisp, perfectly ironed white silk blouse. I tied my hair back into a sleek, severe knot at the nape of my neck, ensuring not a single strand was out of place. I applied minimal makeup, leaving my expression completely sharp, cold, and unsoftened. I looked in the full-length mirror and deeply recognized the woman staring back at me. She was the director of operations. She was the hardened crisis manager who did not flinch when millions of dollars and municipal infrastructures were on the line. She was entirely untouchable. I picked up the heavy black portfolio from the bed, feeling its substantial weight in my hands. A profound, permanent shift occurred in my chest as I walked down the hallway toward the front door. For the past week, a small, deeply wounded part of my inner child had been secretly hoping that this confrontation would somehow yield a genuine apology. A tiny fraction of my heart hoped they would fall to their knees, finally recognize the immense pain they had caused me, and beg for my forgiveness. But as I turned the brass doorknob, that fragile, pathetic hope finally died, replaced by something infinitely stronger and much colder. I was not driving across town to exact petty emotional revenge. I was not going there to scream, to cry, or to finally make them understand how much they had hurt me. You cannot force empathy into the hearts of people who view you only as a convenient utility. I was going there for one singular, clinical purpose. I was going to systematically, legally, and permanently terminate their unauthorized access to my life. I stepped out into the cool evening air, walked to my car, and started the engine. The drive to the suburbs was perfectly, beautifully silent, the quiet ticking of the turn signal counting down the final miles to the end of an era. The dining room of my childhood home smelled heavily of roasted rosemary and caramelized onions, a comforting, domestic aroma that completely betrayed the psychological warfare about to unfold. I walked through the front door precisely at 7 o'clock. I did not wear a soft, accommodating sweater. I wore my tailored black blazer, my armor, and I carried the heavy leather portfolio under my right arm. The first 45 minutes of the evening were a masterclass in suffocating, artificial normalcy. My mother, Elaine, buzzed around the kitchen, pouring glasses of iced tea and talking brightly about the changing weather. My father, Warren, sat at the head of the long oak table, aggressively focused on carving the roast beef. Mason sat across from me, picking at his cuticles, offering a tight, unconvincing smile every time I glanced in his direction. Tessa sat next to him, staring silently at her plate, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. We ate in a tense, terrible rhythm. We talked about lawn care. We talked about the local sports team. Nobody mentioned Iceland. Nobody mentioned the 43 missed calls. Nobody mentioned Meridian Crest Capital. They were playing their roles perfectly, acting as if the impending federal fraud was just an awkward elephant in the room that could be politely ignored until dessert. When the plates were finally cleared, my mother brought out a large, steaming apple pie. As she set it down in the center of the table, the artificial atmosphere instantly evaporated. Mason cleared his throat, a sharp, abrasive sound in the quiet room. He reached into the inner pocket of his casual suit jacket and pulled out a single, neatly folded sheet of paper. He slid it across the polished oak surface until it stopped an inch from my water glass. "Look, Riley," Mason started, his voice adopting that familiar, patronizing tone he always used when he wanted something for nothing. "Let us just get the ugly business out of the way so we can enjoy dessert and move forward. I know you were annoyed about the timing before your trip, but we really need to put this behind us. Just sign the retroactive verification right there. It takes 10 seconds, and then the family can finally breathe again." I did not reach for the paper, I did not raise my voice, and I did not flinch. The old Riley would have started trembling, drowning in the suffocating weight of their collective expectations. But the woman sitting at that table was entirely untouchable. I picked up the heavy black portfolio, placed it squarely on the dining table, and unzipped it with a loud, metallic drag. "I am not signing your retroactive verification, Mason," I stated, my voice as cold and clear as a winter morning. I opened the leather cover. I pulled out the first document, the original commercial guarantee contract, and placed it face up on the wood. Because I cannot verify a financial document that I never originally authorized. This signature, dated 6 months ago, is a federal forgery. Mason let out a short, dismissive laugh, leaning back in his chair. "Oh, please, you are being completely dramatic. You are acting like I robbed a bank. I was going to tell you about it, but the deadline sneaked up on me. It is a technical misunderstanding. Stop overreacting." My father immediately jumped in to reinforce the barricade. He slammed his heavy hand down on the table, rattling the silverware. "Your brother is right, Riley. You are blowing this entirely out of proportion. We are talking about a piece of paper meant to keep his business afloat. Are you honestly going to sit there and threaten to destroy your own brother's future over a technicality family comes first? You know the rules of this house." "A technicality," I repeated softly. I reached into the portfolio and pulled out the thick stack of digital forensics. I laid them out, one by one, forming a paper trail of their absolute destruction. "This is not a technicality, Dad," I said, looking directly into Warren's eyes. "This is the metadata from my old webmail account, the account you pretended to ask about over dinner. This document proves that the verification link was opened using the wireless internet router located in this exact house. Furthermore, this page shows the device signature. It matches the outdated desktop computer sitting upstairs in your den." The color began to drain from Mason's face. Warren opened his mouth to speak, to formulate another lie, but I cut him off. "And before you try to claim that Mason just used your computer while visiting," I continued, my voice gaining momentum, "let us look at the extension request." I pulled out the final, irrefutable pieces of evidence. I placed my printed airline boarding pass next to the forensic timestamp. I placed a high-resolution photograph of myself standing at the departure gate in Keflavík, complete with the location data and the digital clock in the background. The extension request was electronically signed at exactly 2:14 in the morning, Eastern Standard Time, I stated, tapping the paper with my index finger. At 2:14 in the morning, I was at 30,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean. My phone was completely disabled in airplane mode. Unless you want to sit in a federal courtroom and explain to a judge how I managed to bypass international aviation laws to sign a corporate loan, I suggest you shut your mouth. The silence that fell over the dining room was absolute and profound. There was no more scoffing. There were no more passive-aggressive sighs. The reality of the trap I had built around them finally snapped shut. Precisely at 8 o'clock, my cell phone rang. The sound echoed like a gunshot. I answered it and immediately pressed the speakerphone button, setting the device down next to the forged documents. "Riley, it is Nora Kincaid." My attorney's sharp, professional voice filled the terrified room. "I am calling to confirm our schedule. I have the civil settlement documents prepared. If they are not fully executed tonight, I also have the criminal fraud packet and the civil lawsuit ready to go. Do I have your authorization to file the felony complaints with the federal authorities at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning?" Mason let out a choked, panicked sound. He looked at my father, his eyes wide with genuine terror. The imaginary shield of family loyalty had just shattered against the solid wall of federal law. "We are currently reviewing the options. Nora," I said evenly. "I will call you back in 10 minutes with their decision." I disconnected the call. Before I could present the settlement terms, the most shocking twist of the evening occurred. My mother, Elaine, who had been standing frozen near the kitchen archway, suddenly moved. She did not walk over to comfort her golden child. She walked directly to the heavy wooden sideboard against the wall, opened the bottom cabinet, and pulled out a dusty, battered cardboard box. She walked back to the table and violently slammed the box down right next to the apple pie. The lid flew off, spilling a chaotic mess of printed emails, bank statements, and yellow sticky notes across the linen runner. "I thought you just needed her to be a character reference," my mother screamed, her voice cracking with a raw, ugly devastation. She pointed a trembling finger at my father. "I believed you, Warren. But I found this box shoved in the back of your closet yesterday. You did not just forge her name this time." I looked down at the scattered papers. They were copies of my tax returns, my old apartment leases, and my pay stubs. On several of the documents, there were handwritten notes in my father's distinct handwriting, calculating debt-to-income ratios that were not his own. "He has been digging through her basement storage bins for 4 years," my mother sobbed, turning to look at me with an expression of profound, broken apology. "He has been using her financial records to quietly secure microloans and vendor accounts for Mason's old businesses. I knew they borrowed money from you, Riley, but I swear to God, I did not know they were stealing your ghost to do it." Warren shrank back into his chair, the patriarchal authority he had wielded for decades instantly evaporating. He looked like a small, pathetic, terrified old man. Elaine had always enabled Mason, but tonight, faced with the undeniable, documented proof of a multi-year conspiracy engineered by her own husband, she finally chose the truth. "Here is what happens now," I announced, breaking the chaotic tension. I pulled the bound civil settlement from my portfolio and slid 2 copies across the table. I did not ask. I dictated. "You have 2 choices. Choice 1 is that you both sign this agreement right now. You sign a formal admission of guilt regarding the forgery and the identity theft. Mason, you agree to a legally enforced liquidation. You are selling your recreational vehicle, your expensive bicycles, and you are breaking your car lease. Every single dollar goes into a third-party escrow account to pay off this fraudulent debt. Furthermore, you will write a letter of correction, approved by my attorney, and mail it to every single member of our extended family, admitting that you lied about me abandoning you." I turned my absolute focus to my father. "And you, Dad, you sign the permanent legal injunction forbidding you from ever accessing my personal documents again, and you hand over the keys to the basement storage closet right now. Every single piece of paper with my name on it leaves this house with me tonight." I paused, letting the heavy, brutal reality of the terms sink in. Choice 2 is that I pick up my portfolio, I walk out that front door, and Nora files the federal felony complaints tomorrow morning. You will both go to prison. Decide. There was no negotiation. There were no tears from me. I sat perfectly still, watching the absolute destruction of their entitlement. Mason was the first to break. He picked up the pen with shaking hands. Tears streamed silently down his face as he flipped to the signature page and signed away his prized possessions, his fake businesses, and his golden child status. He pushed the document toward my father. Warren stared at the paper for a long time. He looked at my mother, who turned her face away from him in disgust. He looked at me, searching for any trace of the compliant, desperate daughter he used to control. He found nothing but cold, hard steel, defeated. He picked up the pen and signed his name. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the small brass key to the basement storage unit, and placed it on top of the contract. I gathered the signed agreements, sliding them safely into my black portfolio. I picked up the brass key. I did not eat a single piece of the apple pie. I stood up, pushed my chair back in, and walked toward the front door without saying another word. I walked out into the cool night air. Miles was waiting exactly where he promised, his car idling in the driveway, the headlights cutting through the darkness. I opened the passenger door, tossed the portfolio into the back seat, and sank into the leather upholstery. I looked at my husband, let out a massive, shuddering breath, and smiled. For the very first time in my 37 years of life, the phrase family comes first was no longer a shackle around my neck. It was just a meaningless echo left behind in a house I would never enter again. 6 months later, the dust had permanently settled. Mason was forced to abandon his delusions of being a startup visionary. He now works a standard 9-to-5 shift at a regional logistics warehouse, heavily monitored by the escrow company garnishing his wages. My father lives in quiet, isolated disgrace, his reputation within the extended family entirely obliterated by Mason's forced confession letter. My mother occasionally sends me polite, cautious text messages. I reply when I feel like it. The power dynamic is permanently reversed. Miles and I are currently planning our next vacation. We are going to spend 2 weeks exploring the Amalfi Coast. Last night, as we were looking at hotel reservations on the couch, my cell phone began to ring. The caller identification displayed a number from my hometown. I did not panic. My heart rate did not spike. I simply looked at the glowing screen, smiled, placed the phone face down on the coffee table, and let it ring. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please comment below and let us know where you are listening from to connect and share your thoughts. Do not forget to subscribe to the Amelia Revenge Stories channel, like the video, and support us by hitting the hype button so this story can reach more people.